Okay, good morning. We're in the middle of, we're at the end of page 1150 in Ayin Beis, volume 2. And what we concluded here, what we learned yesterday was he's talking about the third interpretation or the third approach in explaining the two levels of ayin, that channel, the between creator and creation in the creative process. One essentially represents the creator, one relates to the created, the creation, existence. And this third interpretation, third approach, he actually mentioned three different ways of explaining it. One is that it's the two levels in the kav. The kav, which is the narrow thread of light that on one hand is post-Tzimtzum, but the top of it, meaning is attached, and it's connected and attached to the Eid Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, and therefore, relatively speaking, it's beyond existence. And that's why Ak, which receives from that level, does not yet have Kalim. And everything is still in a snapshot form. It's not a Metzias Dover. And the second level of the Kav is as the Kav moves downward, the Tachtis, the lower part of the Kav, which is subject, which relates to, is the second ayin that relates to the creation. Then he said, Omnam be'emes, that's bepshittis. Be'emes, we have to say that the whole Era Mamala, the two levels of ayin, is like it is with the two levels of ayin before the tzimtzum. Just like there's etzem and ispashtus, there's the core divine energy in the Er Habligvul, and there's the extended or expressed energy, and that's the two levels of ayin as we learned in the first approach. The same thing, the Er Mamala. Er Mamala is also divine energy, and also has an etzem er and ispashtus er. And that's the two levels of ayin. Where the higher level of Er Pnimi, as I explained at length, is essentially connected an expression of the divine source. Atzmus Ein Sof, he says. He's going to explain that later. That's a Ir Atzmi, that's higher than Hamshach and Gili, higher than extension and revelation. And there's no distinctions there. And then there's this pashtus of the Ir Mamala as it manifests and begins its functioning. And there, it has a shaykhus to. So that's the two levels of ayin. But then at the end of that paragraph, at the bottom of the page, he said, "Ubupratius." You break it down further. Oh, so 1 second. So this second way of explaining mamala ayin is pnimis er and chitzenius er. And then he says a third thing in the parentheses at the end of the paragraph. He says, and more specifically, in the chitzenius er itself, there's also a higher level that's it's higher than being a mocker, a source for the yesh, for the creation. And there's the lower level, or the last level within it, in the chitzenius er itself. And then he concludes, but all this will be explained more later. So there you have it. Then there's that parentheses that I said we'll review after we learn the Tzaddik Dalot, Ulechein gam ba'ak yesh b'chinas kelim. That Ak has Kalim in it. So I will share one thought that came to me after we learned yesterday. Earlier he said that Ak does not have Kalim, it's only called Sheidish Neshamas the Gufis. It's like the beginning of the conceptual container, the way I explained it. And why is that? Because the core and highest level of the Kav, of that intense light is shining there, and therefore there's no yet a shape of something. The shape will come in the second level of the kav, which begins to create akudim, which starts to contain actual containers. Now he says he went a step higher. The higher than the kav, because the kav comes after the tzimtzum, is mamala itself. Mamala kalalman, even before the kav, has in it also two dimensions now we've established. One is the core energy, which is beyond, but then there's this pashtus ha'er of mamala, So it seems like he's saying that because this pashtus is already relating to existence to some extent, even without talking about the kav, that relationship is what allows Ak to begin to have the conceptual, or the what he calls yesh b'chinas kelim, but there's sherish neshamas the Ak, but there's still, in some level, there's still, relatively speaking, to a level of etzem of er mamala, and definitely higher levels, it's already the beginning of some formation. Something is happening. And that answers what I asked, because when you talk about the kav, Ak relates to the higher level of the kav, and therefore there's no real actual containers yet. If you're talking about mamala kalaman, which is higher than the kav, the root of the kav, so then his pashtus mamala is before Ak. And that is what allows that Ak should have something beginning to emerge. That's what it sounds like he's saying in parentheses, but we'll talk about it more, hopefully, when we learn Tzadik Daled, and we'll see if there's any further explanation on this topic. Now, we're going to go now to Tzadik Daled. The reason I'm doing that is because the next section, Ayin Beis, just to give you a taste, because we're going to get back to it, he's going to explain now, once we finish explaining what Ayin is, in all the interpretations, the first one before the Tzimtzum, the second one before the Tzimtzum, after the Tzimtzum, Save of Mamala, the third one in Mamala, in this imminent energy, and in that itself, the few ways of explaining that, he's now going to explain that these two levels of Ayin, even though they're called Ayin in general, they're very different than the way they're seen by the Mashpia and the way they're seen by the Makabel. So he's moving now to the next so-called chapter of this discussion of two levels of Ayin. That's why I feel the best thing to do now is to go to Friedrich Rebbe's Tzadik Daled, which is 5694, and learn how he explains what we just learned, this page, which began in the middle of 1149 and to the bottom 1150. So the Friedrich Rebbe has pages of explanation of this section, of this, essentially this paragraph that we learned. Starts V'hinni Lepomim, the third interpretation of Ayin, of the two levels of Ayin and Mamala. That you can call that the headline. So we're going to go now to Tzadik Daled to see how the Friedrich Rebbe explains it. Those of you that don't have these forum, these books, so go to ayinbeis.com, and all the text is been scanned. You have PDF versions of what we're going to learn. So we're moving to Tzadik Daled now. And on page, let me tell you what, page 80. Yeah. 84, chapter 20. So this is the Friedrich Rebbe taking what we just learned in Ayin Beis 1149, 1150, and the Friedrich Rebbe elaborating. So you'll see language that we just learned, but you'll also see a lot of elaboration. And just to give you the scope of this, this is going to be 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah. Around 7, 8 pages, where the Friedrich Rebbe is going to elaborate on this one page we just learned. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1.5. Yeah, around 7 pages. Okay. So page 84, the chapter begins, Omnam Yesh Shita Shlishis. Remember, the Friedrich Rebbe called these approaches, the Rebbe Rashab just called them the Pomim. At times it's explained this way, and then the intention here is to explain a different way. So actually, let me correct myself. It's not from the V'hinei Lepomim. That we already discussed by the Friedrich Rebbe. That was chapter 19, the second interpretation and approach, or Shitta, which is Eira Seviv. What we're learning now, chapter 20, is the bottom of page 1149, where the Rebbe Rashab said, Omnam kana kavona. Omnam kan, meaning in this mimer, in this discourse, in this series, the kavona, the intention is a third approach, that the two levels of ayin are the two levels of the two dimensions of Ur. One that relates to the Yesh Hamiti, one to the Yesh HaMesaveh, one to the creator, one to the producer, one to the product, is imamalish. He says, Omnam Yeshita Shlishis, Ba'ayin Hamamutza ben Yesh Hamiti v'Yesh HaNivra. See, the Frierdiker Rebbe introduces the word Shita. There's a third approach. Shita is sometimes third opinion, but here's third approach. In explaining this ayin, this channel, that's an interface between the true reality and the created reality. Yesh Amiti, Yesh Nivra. And what is this third approach? The klolos ha'ayinu er pnimi. That the general ayin is not seviv, it's not before the tzimtzum, it's all in er pnimi. In the er pnimi, in the internal immanent energy. There are two levels. And this er pnimi, the immanent and internalized energy, divine energy, that's designated to permeate, shape and create existence, divides into two. And here's the Frierdiker Rebbe's way of putting, the Frierdiker Rebbe Rashab said, Omnam kana kavona. The Frierdiker Rebbe says, Ulefi neisei ha'inyan, hamavur kan. He has the words, Lefi neisei ha'inyan hamavur kan. According to the subject matter. I mean, neisei ha'inyan is hard to translate. How do you say neisei ha'inyan? Neisei ha'inyan. You could even say Neisa Inya means the carrier of the idea, but it could be the spirit. Basically, according to the spirit of the discussion here, that's explained here, Hakavonahu Bashita Hashlishis. The intention, meaning the kavana in this Neisa Inyan discussed in this mimer, the Frierdiker Rebbe Rashab's words, Hakavona, the klolos, that what is the third opinion, the third approach, the klolos ha'ayin, that the general ayin, this channel, this field of energy, which is the interface between the real, the true reality, God, the source, and the created reality, is the level of immanent energy. I want to just say one thing, why I think they're emphasizing that the kavana kan. Why tackle not the other levels? Why can't you say Ayin Beis is talking about all the levels? Three different interpretations. Why is he making it such an issue that Lufia Nesa kavana kan? So unless I'll be corrected when we learn something later, my assumption would be the following. Because if you may remember, many times in Ayin Beis, starting in volume 1 early on, he spoke about the two shittas in the Pnimi, Kav. One is, are Eiris mitsuyarim or not, or pshutim? Does the have any subtle shape and form, or is the completely shapeless, and all the shape comes and form comes from the containers? There is such a shitta, there is such an approach. The Pardes and others say it like that it's technically like clear water in tinted glasses. So the water doesn't change shape. The water has no shape or color. When you put it into a colored glass, a tinted glass, it appears to take on color, but it still maintains its shapelessness and its colorlessness. Or do you say that in the Oyer, there's subtly some form of, I don't want to say color, but some form of, in other words, Eir HaChochma has some energy called the light and energy of Chochma. And then it's tailored to fit into the container. Of course, the container gives it much more concrete shape. There's two shittas. The truth is, they're both correct. It all depends on Pnimius HaKav, Chitzenius HaKav. But in a number of places in Ayin Beis, he says that in Drush Khan, in this Drush here, meaning Ayin Beis, we're going according to the second approach. The approach that Ur has in it some form of subtle structure. And that's why the Kav is rooted in the 10 hidden spheres, because the 10 hidden spheres, even though there's not yet any shaped spheres, but they are called 10 hidden spheres. God's envisioning. And therefore the Ur HaGvul has in it some form, it's very subtle, and it will not manifest until after the Tzimtzum and definitely after it goes into containers, but there's something there. Why is it relevant? So if that indeed is the approach in this drush, so that's why he's saying HaKavona Khan is we're not talking about the higher levels of ayin. We talked about them, but the main focus in this drush, meaning in this hemshech, is the element of how it relates to existence. And even there's two levels of ayin. One that's removed, even though there's some shape or form in a very subtle way, it's still removed from existence. And the second is when it relates to existence. Or another way that you can explain it is maybe the higher level of the Kav or of Mamala. I'd say of Pnimi, of Er Pnimi, is maybe beyond shape. And the second level is shape. But why is it Khan? Why is this the main focus? Because in Ayin Beis, in contrast to Samach Vov, in Samach Vov, the focus is more according to the first approach. Because in Samach Vov, my way of explaining it, he's talking about a ben shenasa eved. I'm sorry, eved ben shenasa, eved ben shenasa eved, eved shenasa ben, eved shenasa ben. There you're talking about a I don't remember which way it goes. 1 second. In Samach Vav, bottom line is mamata lamad. The avoda is avoda b'koyach atzmai, and that means that we're going outside of leaving our shape and form to connect to the divine. So ben shenasa eved, yeah, I would say ben shenasa eved. So it's a ben, but you're losing your giluyim in order to connect to higher levels of the divine. So the focus there is on a oir that's not shaped. In Ayin Beis, it goes the other way around, mamayla lamata, to bring the ben, the eved shenasa ben, which means, I may be wrong with that. I have to think that through again. But bottom line, it's more tighter than tefillah. It's about bringing elikus into the structure of existence. So the focus is more according to the opinion that the Eir has some elements of shape and form, which is why I would explain that this Kavona Khan is talking more on the Pnimi than in the Makif and in the Bligvul. That's the way I would explain it, ostensibly at least. That would be a race from sich. Yeah. Samach Vo would be Ben Shanasa Eved, and Ayin Beis would be Eved Shanasa Ben. Because a Ben is closer to has a connection to the father. Eved is more the Aveda, the hard effort. Yeah. Okay. So now let's continue here. Okay. Okay. So Kavana Khan who bashita ashlish the kolos ayno mamutza ben yesh amiti ben yesh anivra who b'chines er pnimi. So it's bringing this idea into the er pnimi that it has both dimensions to it. The er pnimi zeh, and this immanent energy nechlak atzmai itself nechlak l'shnayim, divides into two. Now, the Frierdiker Rebbe is now going to use the language of the Rebbe Rashab. Remember the first interpretation, Hine l'cheri yeshlemer b'pshitis. The Frierdiker Rebbe Rashab's language, l'cheri b'zeh yeshlemer b'pshitis. It's the same, just he reorders it a bit. And now, l'cheri, seemingly yeshlemer b'pshitis, we can say in an obvious way, what is the two levels of the pnimi? The b'chinas ayin zeh hu akav atzmei. That this ayin is we're talking about the kav itself, and the kav breaks into two levels. And he's now going to explain what we learned in the last few days in Ayin Beis. Then he's going to come back and say, but be'emes, the Frierdiker Rebbe is going to get back to this in a while from now. It's going to be on chapter 22, on page 107. Where he's going to go, but the truth is, that be'emes, the pnimi in general, divides into two. The second way of explaining the two levels of ayin pnimi. But now he's going to start with the pshitus. L'cheri yeshlem b'pshitus. That the kav is the ayin, and there's two levels in the kav, in that narrow, thin light that shines after the tzimtzum. Tehine yakav ime yesh. This is literally word for word from Ayin Beis. So I'm going to read it relatively faster than usual. The kav, even though it transmits and it transmits and it's drawn, extends after the tzimtzum, not before, after the tzimtzum. Its extension its amshach, its transmission is coming from Ein Sof before the tzimtzum. And the kav touches and is attached to, connected and attached to the Ein Sof Baruch Hu, the infinite divine light before the tzimtzum. Like he says in Eitz Chaim, the acharat tzimtzum, after the tzimtzum, himshich kav echod da'ak, God drew, himshich, he extended a kav echod, one line, very narrow or thin one line, single line, me'era igul shalei, from the era igul, remember from the light of the igul agadol, the light, the igul, the circle of the light that remained after the tzimtzum surrounding the cholol, the space. That's where the kav extended from. The reishisei shel kav negeya v'dovuk be'ein sof. The head, the top edge of the kav of this line touches and is attached to the Ein Sof. That's what it says in Eitz Chaim explicitly. V'hainu, which means, and this means shehu er hadovuk b'mkeireh. That means that the kav is a light that's attached to its source. It's not detached. It's attached. Like we spoke the example that when the teacher begins to teach even Aleph Beis Gimel, simple things to beginner students, his ideas are coming and are attached to his mind. That was pre the tzimtzum that he used in order to bring these ideas down to the student's level. And now he continues. All this we learned in Ayin Beis just a few days ago. That's why I'm not going to elaborate again, because we learned it. Now he explains this further. What is this thing with this kav, that the top of the kav is attached? He says, because the amshach, the inyan of the amshach is a kav. What is its, basically its inyan, its, I don't say purpose, its function, its mohus, its personality of the extension of the kav, of the transmission of the kav. Hulasis milo mata. That's its inyan, to create hierarchy, levels, milo umata, higher and lower. Being that the kav at its top edge, at the top of the kav, negeya, it touches v'davuk be'ein sof, and it's connected and attached to the infinite divine light. Ubiktseu hatachten, and its bottom edge, does not touch, does not go all the way down in the cholol, in that space, all the way to the bottom where it touches the Ein Sof that surrounds the whole space. It does not. Al Kain, therefore, Kamoshu Bikirav El Makede. So that creates a situation that the way the kav is close to its source, meaning on the top, hu b'bchinas maila, knows whatever is closer to the top is a state of a higher state, maila, a higher state, and as it gets distant from its source, because remember, as the kav goes down, it doesn't touch the bottom, so it gets distant. Obviously, all conceptually, hu b'bchinas mato, that's in the state of a lower state. So higher and lower is defined by how much energy it's relating to, how much energy it's connected to. The higher levels, the higher you go, the higher it gets. The lower you go, the lower levels merge. So that's Milo Mata, due to the Kav being one that's connected to the source at the top and not at the bottom. Now he continues the next point that the Rebbe Rashab said. V'yadua, da Milo Mata shebekav, this hierarchy, these levels of higher and lower, spatial higher and lower quality in the Kav, that's not just due to miyut. It's not just due to less energy, more energy. This distinction of a higher level and lower level is not just you have like as I mentioned. Let's say you have the light of the sun. You're closer to the sun, you have more light. You're farther from the sun, you have less light. That's a quantitative, only a matter of diminishment. That doesn't fundamentally say that something that is further is fundamentally a lower level. You just happen to be further from the light. He says the truth is no, the Milo Mata that the Kav creates is also a qualitative one. The Chochmah Shalamayla Bina, when you say Chochmah is higher than Bina, it means it's fundamentally higher. It's not just that Chochmah is closer to the source and Bina is further from the source. That Chochmah is a different reality. It's a higher qualitative reality than Bina is. And same thing when we say Kesser is higher than Chochmah. It's not just more energy, it's qualitatively higher. It's in its core level. The kol zeh hu ayidei amaylo mata shalakav. All this is due to the Milo Mata of the Kav. And as I explained, the Frierdiker Rebbe is now going to explain this a lot more at length. From here on, the Frierdiker Rebbe's addition. Till now, everything from Ayin Beis. Now the Frierdiker Rebbe begins to elaborate. So I explained, and it's based somewhat on this, but let's see how the Frierdiker Rebbe says it, that he's saying that the Kav is more than just a regulator of more light or less light. The Kav is actually a shaper of reality that actually shapes and defines different levels. So it's true that the higher levels have more light and the lower levels have less light and energy, but it's more than just that. It's actually shaped differently. Chochmah from Bina, Kesser from Chochmah, and so on. And all this is created by the Kav. So the Kav is a Milo Mata, not just a, you could say it's like it's not just like someone putting a filter in front of a projector and you're opening it a little more, opening it a little less. That's miyut. That's diminishing or increasing the light. It actually shapes and creates. I explained the reason for that he's emphasizing that is most likely because he's trying to explain how there's the level of the Kav that actually creates the structure of existence. So there's the ayin of the yesh HaMesaveh that's a mokir for the yesh. It actually relates to the yesh in specific details, this lower level of the Kav. Then there's the higher level of the Kav that we're going to learn about that's higher, that is beyond, relates to the higher level of ayin. That's most likely why he's emphasizing this. But let's see, the Frierdiker Rebbe is now going to elaborate on this topic. So till here, we really just reviewed what it says in Ayin Beis, and now continues the explanation for a good few pages, a good 2 pages now.
Is the Igul HaGodel la'achar HaTzimtzum?
The Igul HaGodel is no such thing as an Igul HaGodel before the Tzimtzum, because everything mamala kola emetzias. When there's no Tzimtzum, there's no Igul. And when there's no Tzimtzum, everything is just poshut. Once there's a Tzimtzum, So now we created space called the Cholol Umokim Pani, right? A space where the Kav is going to extend into. The Igul HaGodel is the Oyer, Ein Sof Lifnei HaTzimtzum, that is now remains outside of the Igul, outside of the Cholol. That's why it's called the Igul HaGodel. So technically it's Eir Lifnei HaTzimtzum, but its existence as the Igul HaGodel does not happen until the Tzimtzum happens.
The
And the
Histalkus,
Kav originates from there.
the Histalkus of the Or, the Sirik of Or, before Tzimtzum, only took place in, so to speak, the space of the Cholol that will exist afterwards. And the Igul HaGodel is just the remainder. There is no Sirik in Igul HaGodel.
Igul HaGodel is light. So what with I mean, as I already explained, that if you look in Samach Vov in the end of Maimer Adam Ki Yakriv, he brings two opinions whether the Tzimtzum impacted the Igul HaGodel or not. But however you explain it, the Igul HaGodel is light. So clearly the Tzimtzum didn't impact it in the full sense because there's there, it exists. It's a light. It's the light before the Tzimtzum that now surrounds the Cholol Umokim Pani.
Okay.
I mean, instead of talking mechanics, let me go back to the example of teacher and student. I always tell you to do that, but I guess I haven't gotten through yet, because this is mechanical, and mechanics, I can't speak about mechanics. I'm not an auto mechanic. So I'll talk about how I understand the Havana of it, and that may be helpful. The teacher has brilliance, he's learning by himself, and his full glory. No concealments, no tzimtzumim, nothing, no kav. He's learning with all his brilliance. So imagine it's a infinitely brilliant teacher. I know it's still not a perfect example because he's a teacher, he's not God. But for our practical purposes, this is the Alter Rebbe's mashal. So he's completely learning. As a matter of fact, any other would disturb him, and they would be disturbed by him because he has no room for another. He's learning on his own level. But then he chooses to become a teacher. To do so, if he continues with all his brilliance shining, it would be like the ocean completely covering everything and submerging everything. There's no room for anything else. There's no space for anything else. So he needs to create space. Not talking about physical space, because remember, he's sitting at his table. This doesn't mean you can't walk into the room. In Ein Sof Lifnei HaTzimtzum, there is nowhere to walk into. You can't walk in. But conceptually speaking, there's no room in his Dalet Amas of learning. There's only him and his learning. That's all there is. Hu Ushmai Bilvad. And it's completely the divine consciousness. In this case, the teacher's consciousness is all that exists. Now he wants to create space for a student. This space is going to be called a Cholol Umokim Pani. He actually conceals his teaching and his learning. He silences himself. This doesn't mean he loses his brilliance. Legabe, the teacher, there's no tzimtzum, because he didn't become less intelligent. His brilliance is still there, but it's not shining in the space where a student can now walk into the classroom or into his room, into his environment, and there's room for the student. So first thing, he has to create conceptual space and room for a student. That's the Cholol Umokim Pani. Then he begins, the Kav is when he begins to transmit. After he created space and prepared himself, now he begins to teach. He starts from the beginning of Gemara, of Mishnah, the first Mishnah, and begins to explain what is Me'emasai. What's he doing? The flow of the Kav is coming from his intelligence. But from the student's point of view, they're receiving now a very narrow stream. Now, where's the Igul HaGodel in all of this? Very simple. If you think about his brilliance before he left space, then there's nothing. There's only his brilliance. That's the equivalent of Ein Sof Lifnei HaTzimtzum in the mashal and the nimshal. Not perfect mashal, but just for the example purposes. Once he created space, there's space for the student. But what happened to the Oyer? What happened to his Oyer, HaSeichel, once he created space? So I said it didn't disappear. He didn't lose his intelligence. He can access it at a minute. And as a matter of fact, it's still there within his mind. So we call this an Igul HaGodel at this point. that the levels of Oyer, that where he began to say, I'm going to create space to prepare for the student, that Oyer is now not in the space of the student. In a way, it hovers above what the Alter Rebbe calls makif, not makif as surrounding, but it's beyond. The student doesn't have access to it, but the teacher does. Now, the Igul HaGodel is the lowest level of Eir Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. It's not the highest level. Higher levels are not even subject to that. They altogether are not, either they're not subject to concealment altogether. Like I said, an etzem you can't conceal because it's not revealed. Or different levels of how the tzimtzum, the most the tzimtzum does, it doesn't let them shine in the space of the teacher, of the student rather. So it doesn't shine in the cholol. Where does it shine? It shines in the teacher. So in him, there's still the Igul HaGodel. He may not even be thinking about it, but it's there. And that would be the Igul HaGodel, which happens only after the tzimtzum, because before the tzimtzum, there's no Igul. Before the tzimtzum is all his brilliance, is consuming him and everything about him. So when you think about it like that, then you can begin to understand. And the Kav will be a stream of consciousness that comes from that Igul HaGodel, which is frankly attached to all of Eir Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. But remember, there are levels of Eir Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum that are beyond the Igul HaGodel and beyond Ratzon and Etzem Ha'er and all the way going up that don't even relate. Now, if you ask where are the levels we learned about Lifnei Tzimtzum, remember the teacher in his own consciousness can begin to consider Heskim and Shakavataria and Achlota that he's going to have a relationship with another, and then even envision the details and prepare resources. All that's possible before the tzimtzum. But the tzimtzum is when he actually creates that space and says, now the student can enter and the process of creation or the process of teaching can begin. So the Igul HaGodel essentially represents the lowest levels of pre-tzimtzum consciousness, but can only, but you don't call it an Igul HaGodel until there's a tzimtzum.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay. So now the Frierdiker Rebbe continues to explain the Kav. Now we said the Etzem Madrigos are fine. He says, in all this, the Kol Zeh, Amaylo Mata Shel HaKav. All this, what does he mean by all this? He means both the diminished Oyer and also the Etzem Madrigosa, the distinction of Chochmah from Bina. Yeah. Let me just add one more line about this because he said this earlier in volume 1 of Ayin Beis. When God envisioned the 10 spheres, remember the artist envisioning the art, before the Tzimtzum, he envisioned specifics. They're not yet specifics in actuality, but the Eibishter wanted a Chochmah and a Bina, and a Das, and a Chesed, and a Gvura. So he didn't just want one level that just has 10 levels of diminishment. That you would say would be one Chochmah, and there's a higher level of Chochmah, a lower level, a lower. No, he didn't just want diminished states of divine energy, he also wanted this structure. And structure is vital to the whole plan. That is what the Kav creates. So the Kav actually has two instructions. One is create actual Chochmah Bina, and number two, regulate the light according to each one. One will have more Eir and one will have less Eir. And that's what defines the structure and hierarchy of Seder Shtalshlus. Okay. So he continues. Being that the Milo Mata, what we just said, the hierarchy, the levels, within Shaboy, Atzmei, Einadakshu B'chinas Miyut, within the, I guess he means within the Kav itself. Let me just see it a second. Yeah. It's not Einadakshu B'chinas Miyut. We just said it's not only in a state of diminished light and more light or less light. Ki'im hu dargis chalukis be'etzem madregosam. It's different levels, distinct levels, be'etzem madregosam, their core level. in their core personality. They're different. L'chein hinegam hamaylo mata she'oisahu hu gam ke mashem chalukim be'etzem madregosa. Let me just read this again. Okay. What he's saying is like this. He's adding to what the Rebbe Rashab said. Let me just explain again. If you have, let's say, light shining in through your window, okay, and you want to put up a curtain so the light shouldn't shine so much. Then you want to put a heavier curtain, right? Or you want different people in the house to receive different elements of light. So that's all diminished, that's all miut, and that's all b'derech miut, and what's the opposite of miut? Chizuk, yes. That's all miut ha'er. Nothing's changed. You're just regulating that the light, more of it should come, less of it should come. The Kav doesn't just do that. The Kav actually has within it embedded instructions. And that's why the Kav itself doesn't just have Milo Mata, that the higher level of the Kav is closer to the source. Like he said, that's Mila. And the lower level is more distant. The Kav also has in its structure. It's not yet defined structure, but it has the embedded, let's call it the programming is there. The source code is there. And what does that code say? That there's going to be a Chochmah and it's going to be a Bina. So what he's saying now is that the reason the Kav creates Ma'ila Mata, so first we spoke about because the Kav itself, when it's closer to the top, therefore it creates something that's more qualitatively divine. A little lower down is a little less quality in the Gili. But more than that, the Kav also has within it a structural element, which means it's not just more and less. It's also that Chochmah is different than Bina. So for example, when we say Daimim Tzameach Chai Medaber, yes, the Daimim has less life force revealed than a Medaber, and less than a Tzameach, and less than a Chai, and less than a Medaber. But we are not different from animals and vegetation and mineral only in miut. It's not like a stone is a human being, but very diminished light. A plant is a human being with a less and less diminished light. No, it's four qualitative different structures that they're fundamentally different. Part of their difference is that, yes, in Chai, in Medaber, there's more divine, there's more energy and more revealed energy, Seichel and so on, than in a Chai, and Chai more than a Tzameach, and Tzameach more than a Daimim. A Daimim is lifeless. A Tzameach grows. A Chai moves about, and there's a living force inside it. And a Medaber is a human being with Seichel and all the Neshama and so on. They're not just different in Gili and Helam, in Miut. They are fundamentally different. How do they get that difference? If it was only diminished light, then they should just be, it should all be one thing, just diminished. It should be like in human beings itself, a very intelligent human being and a less intelligent human being. Or the same thing in Chai. But they're actually different species. They're different kingdoms. They're different personalities completely. It's not like you stick a neshama of a human being into a stone, God forbid, and the stone becomes a human being. It doesn't work that way. Even though there's gilgul, but it's a tsar. It's a pain for the neshama to go into an animal or some other form of life form. Why? Because they're not matched for each other. It's like putting a human being into a sack. Because they're fundamentally different. So he's explaining, where does this fundamental difference come from? Not just, so the Kav has to have in it instructions that God said, I want to have a tzemeh, a medaber and a chai and a tzemech and a dem. I'm just using that because it's a little easier to understand. But the same thing is chachma and bina, keseh, chachma, bina, and the rest of the spheres. So what he's saying now and adding, then this is what he's going to explain now at length. He says the Kav, not only the diminishment and the ribuya miut, that's the expression, ribuya miut ta'ir, more light or less light, that's due to the Kav being either closer to the top of the Kav or further down. That's Maila Mata due to diminishment. But what about the structure element? Because so he says the Kav itself also has a structure. I'll read it again now. So he says like this. Not just the diminishment. The liyasha mailo mata shebay atzmai, ein rakshu b'chinas miyat. Being that the maila mata is in the kav itself. I'm sorry, no. The liyasha mailo mata shebay atzmai, ein rakshu b'chinas miyat. This maila mata within the kav is not just diminished or more or less light. Kim hu dargis chalukas be'etzem edrigosam. They're actually distinct levels in the etzem madrega, in their core, distinct levels in their core madrega, their core level. That's why the maila mata that the kav creates, it's also that these different levels are fundamentally different, not just a matter of diminished light or less light, less or more light. Okay. Now he continues. If you remember, this kav is the way it's effectuated. The kav is the process of implementing this distinction. But now he goes back. So what's the role of the tzimtzum? The tzimtzum, however, is necessary because it creates the possibility for the kav to do this. If there was no tzimtzum, as much as the kav has instructions to create structure and to create levels on Milo Mata, there's nowhere to do it because Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, there are no levels. In the infinite divine light, the teacher, as he's learning, it doesn't matter. He may be preparing a kav, but that kav cannot become effective until there's a tzimtzum. So that's what he adds now. This is from Ayin Beis. Ayin Beis said this. He says, the Milo Mata ba kav atzmei. So what causes this ischalkus in the kav? He says, "Ba al yedei tzimtzum." Kav atzmei hu al yedei tzimtzum. That's through the tzimtzum. Now, we understand that to mean that the tzimtzum didn't create the ischalkus, the tzimtzum allowed the ischalkus to emerge. Because even if God envisioned this structure before the tzimtzum, because it's all submerged in Erev Bligvul, there's no place for it to become effective. It would be like the teacher in his brilliance, he's imagining and envisioning the student. That's still not enough. He needs to become silent. He needs to create space that the student can be there without being overwhelmed by the teacher. So it's not just enough that the teacher prepares. So who does that? What does that? That's the tzimtzum. The teacher's tzimtzum creates the ischalkus. So in truth, it's really a ischalkus that was already envisioned before the tzimtzum, but it is the tzimtzum that actually separates. If you remember in Ayin Beis, he quoted and he said he said these words. I just want to see where he says Ma'ala Mata. From B'maimer V'ahiya Onan. So what he said there was that the tzimtzum conceals all the bligvul. So now the ischalkus in the oir can emerge. So if you read it without understanding that, you can read this not that way, that the tzimtzum actually creates the ischalkus. The truth is it does, but not completely. It does it by concealing everything else so that his ischalkus can emerge. We learned that in the Maimer of Pesach, in Ayin Hey, Vahiyah Onan, what that means exactly. So sometimes you could say it's the tzimtzum that caused the ischalkus, because without the concealment, there's no distinctions. Everything is like one. But if you break it down, it's really that tzimtzum is revealing the ischalkus, the eir hagvul that was there before the tzimtzum, but it could not be seen or discerned. Both ways are accurate, what I just said. So practically speaking, he does use the words that tzimtzum nasa ischalkus. It doesn't say nasa. It's through the tzimtzum that this ischalkus takes place in the kav, and as he explains, the ayidei sha'er ba shalei ba'adraga. That was the words from Ayin Beis. Due to the fact that the air comes in a leap, shalei ba'adraga, it's not a smooth flow. If it was a smooth flow, then there would be no ischalkus because the air is pashut, the air is shapeless. The shalei ba'adraga nasa ischalkus ba'er. So the air can now have ischalkus. So in the example of the teacher, he can prepare himself within his own mind, having different ideas. That's his chalkus, a structure that he's going to convey, but he needs a tzimtzum to allow himself to convey it, or if not, it all be submerged in his brilliant bligvul intelligence or bligvul energy. By chalkus, he says, Ein rak b'ribuy amiyut. Again, this chalkus is not just ribuy amiyut, more light or less light. Ki'im be'etzem madrigosan mamish. Etzem madrigosan mamish. The actual structural difference. I would say the word structure, the actual distinct difference between one level and the next. Be'etzem madrigosan mamish. That's not just more light, less light. The actual madrega itself is different. Now the Frierdiker Rebbe continues with an elaborating on this. He says, the lechere eine move on. Because here comes a question. If you're thinking about what's the obvious question? How did ischalkus come from achdus? How did distinction come in the first place? Everything we're talking about now, the kav is the paintbrush, is the one that implements this distinction. Not just the miyut and ribui, not just the diminished more or less light, but also distinct levels. And the tzimtzum is the cause that allows that space. So l'cheir ein moving. Eichma ein sof echad aposhet. How did it happen that ein sof, that is echad aposhet, a completely indivisible unity? Poshet means completely shapeless, seamless, total utter unity. How is it possible? So from that utter unity, shapeless unity, seamless, there should be a multitude and distinctions and levels and differences. One is not just one among many. Oneness of God is not one and not two. It's total, utter, seamless, shapeless energy. So how did Ribuy Neschalkus come from there? That's his question. Eine Muvan. So now he's going to discuss this, and this is all an explanation in what the Kav is all about in creating structure. And we're going to come back, obviously, to the theme here that the Kav has two levels of Ayin. So we'll read a few lines, but I'm going to stop more or less here. So he's now going to go into a long discussion, relatively longer discussion of the different ways the Makubalim explain the big question, how from Ech Achdus Hapshuta comes Ribuy Neschalkus. V'hine, Hapardis, Shar Dalet Perik Dalet. The Pardis is Ramoshe Kardavira Ramak. He was a contemporary, older than the Arizal, but he was in Sfas when the Arizal arrived. Famous Arizal was maspid him when he passed away, but he was a major Mekubal. Only the Arizal surpassed him. So Ramak, and we learn Chassidus brings the Pardis of Ramak, as other Svarim the Ramak. So he's quoting the Pardis now. Pardis, the Sefer, is called Sefer HaPardis. Shar Dalet Perek Dalet, Gate 4, Chapter 4. What does he say there? He addresses this question. How from Echad HaPoshut comes Ribuy and Neschalkus? Mevayer, in Pardis, he explains that the distinctions, the Ischalkus, the division, comes due to the Kelim, the containers. And he gives an example. Like, for example, this light of the sun, which is Er Poshet. It's a shapeless light. It has no color on its own. when it radiates, when it shines in many different windows. This is the Pardes example. The windows have different different windows which have different colors, shaped colors. He says white, red, and green. So tinted white glass. So basically windows made of different colored glass, white, red, and green. The Rebbe has a footnote in Tov Shin Yud. He explains why he chose these three colors. It's Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, but I'll just talk about that later if necessary. Yisra, La'ayin Haraya, page 85. Bigvanim Elu, Loven, Edem Yorik. So to the observer, to the eye of the observer, what do you see? If you're standing on this side of the window, of the glass, of the panes of glass, white, red, and green, you see these three colors. So the light of the sun doesn't have a color. In other words, if you went outside and not looking through the windows, you'd see plain white light or whatever. No, not white, just plain white. But once it's shining through the windows give it a color. These three colors as an example. This change in the color of the light is not nikne by eratzme. It's not assumed and absorbed. Nikne means like a kinyan, nikne, that it assumes, acquires a better word. This change in the color is not acquired by the air itself. The air was not affected by it. The air poshet kameishu. The air is shapeless and colorless the way it is. So why do we see colors? It's only due to the fact, because that's what the eye sees. So he says this is the part, this is the mashal. What's the nimshal? And the same thing is above the air that manifests in containers. That the Eir Ein Sof, the godly divine energy, manifests inside of containers. So Legaba Nevroim, the recipients, meaning us looking at it, like the Ayin Areh, the observer, who's seeing this, it looks to us like the color of the container. Avla Eir Mitzadatz Mehuposhet. But the Eir itself is shapeless. In other words, so how does he explain Echad and Achdus and Hischalkus and Ribui? He says the truth is everything is one. There is no real distinction. Distinction is only in our eyes, like the different colors that we see through different colored tinted glasses, tinted windows. That's the Pardes answer. But the Frierdiker Rebbe is going to say, Ach be'emes ein zeh teretz maspik. But in truth, this is not an adequate answer. But because it's already a little late, I'm going to stop here. So he's going into this discussion of how distinction and hischalkus, different levels, emerges from shapeless unity. And he brought the first answer from the Pardes, but he's going to negate it. He's going to, or not negate it, he's going to say it's not satisfying. It's not adequate. And he's going to explain why. And obviously then come with a better explanation or a more complete explanation. All this is coming to explain the Milo Mata that the Kav creates through the Tzimtzum. And now he's discussing how does that happen? What's the dynamics? How from Achdus becomes Ischalkus. And of course, this is going to lead us back to the two levels of Ayin that are the interface between the Achdus and the Ischalkus, to put it in other terms. Okay, so we'll stop here, top of 85, page 85. And we'll continue tomorrow.